Program, Geraldo Cadava. He is an associate professor of history at Northwest University and the author of the newly released The Hispanic Republican, The Shaping of an American Political Identity from Nixon to Trump. Geraldo, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Sam.
So let me just start with this, and then I guess we'll just start more or less with a couple of questions I had that just emanate out of the title. Hispanic versus Latino. The who, and Latino, my understanding is Latino refers to people coming from Latin America. Hispanic refers to people who speak Spanish.
Sure.
Why Hispanic Republican as opposed to Latino Republican?
Well, you have asked the kind of central question in all of Latino history, who or what is a Latino or a Hispanic. So Hispanic is certainly the term preferred by Republicans. Republicans today are kind of okay with the term Latinos, like Trump's campaign team is called Latinos for Trump. So term shifts. I think you're right that Hispanic has had to do with spoken Spanish, but it also has to do with a kind of hearkening back to the Spanish Empire and a kind of reverence for and pride in Spanish heritage. I think that has something to do with it. It's still the term preferred by Hispanics or Latinos in particular areas, like New Mexico is the kind of classic example for embracing the term Hispanic or Hispano even. So part of it has to do with geography, part of it has to do with updating terms to reflect the times, part of it has to do with political sensibilities. And I would say that Hispanic is certainly the term preferred by Republicans. It's certainly the term that will get you into the least trouble if you apply it to them.
And is that different from Democrats?
I would say so. I mean, in the broadest of terms, again, it has to do with geography in some cases. So I think, Democratic Latinos or Hispanics might call themselves Hispanics in certain parts of the country. But I think broadly, I would feel comfortable saying that most Democrats refer to themselves as Latinos.
Okay.
Even embracing the term Latinx, which
right.
is the farthest from what Hispanic Republicans would do.
Okay, and so let me ask you, why start with Nixon as opposed to any other time?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the first two chapters are actually about the early efforts by the Eisenhower and Goldwater campaigns to recruit Hispanics, but it really takes off with the Nixon administration, because he, during his re-election in 1972, is the first Republican candidate to win approximately 30 to 35% of the Hispanic vote, compared with all other Republican candidates who won in the single digits. And since 1972, the result for Republicans has been much closer to the 30 to 35% that Nixon has won than to the single digit support they won since then. So I really do think the Nixon administration is the kind of turning of the tide.
And it's actually not even the administration as much as it is the candidacy, right? I mean, the argument that you make in the book is that, or one of them is that the Hispanic, I guess, to the extent that there is a Hispanic relationship with the Republican Party, 1/3 of Hispanics, approximately, it changes, went from an affinity for the man in Nixon and Reagan into an affinity for the party. So let's start with what was it about Nixon and I guess Reagan, really? Those are the two Republicans we're talking about since Nixon. I mean, the first two after Nixon, including Nixon, I guess. What was it about them that built this relationship with the Hispanic voter?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot happening in the late 60s, early 70s. And, I'll start there and say that beginning in the early 1960s, African Americans are kind of fleeing from the Republican Party in droves after the Republican Party, and Barry Goldwater in particular, takes a strong stand against civil rights. And Nixon, his presidential campaigns, his reelection campaign, is very explicit about the fact that they need to replace those lost votes. And the demographic they turn to is Hispanics, first and foremost. So that's happening. The other thing I think that's going on is that Nixon and Reagan have these Western identities, and they claim familiarity with the Mexican-American community in California in particular as the basis of their outreach to Hispanics nationally. And so, Nixon himself has this kind of origin story of growing up in the fields, the agricultural fields near Whittier, California, east of Los Angeles, and how he came into contact with Mexican Americans then. And Reagan has a very similar story. He's from Illinois, of course, but he spends kind of formative years in California and talks a lot in the late 60s and 70s about how, as the governor of California, he appointed more Mexican Americans to his gubernatorial administration than any of his 20th century predecessors. So what happens when Reagan starts to run for president in the the time he actually wins in the late 1970s, in the lead up to the 1980 election, is his Hispanic supporters start saying to other Hispanics as an effort to recruit them, we know that the Republican Party hasn't always supported our community's interests, but here you have this man, Ronald Reagan, a Western governor, the governor of California, who really stands for us and represents our interests. So why don't you take a look at him and vote for Reagan, the man, not the Republican Party? And that logic actually shifted by the early 21st century to supporting the Republican Party over individual candidates like Donald Trump.
Well, I mean, was the pitch just based upon Reagan is appointing Mexican Americans to positions out of California? I mean, was there material benefits that Reagan was providing?
Or that's Nixon, a great question.
Or Nixon, for that matter?
I think that was the basis of his pitch. That's how he got, say, Cubans in Florida or Puerto Ricans in New York to listen to the pitch that he has a long-standing familiarity with Hispanic communities. But yes, I mean, this is kind of my grandfather's story, actually. He served in the military, then retired, in the 1960s, worked at a golf course washing dishes and worked in silver mines, and then voted Democrat up until 1980, when for the first time he voted for Ronald Reagan, because at the time he was working as a silver miner in the Silver Bell mine in Arizona near Tucson. And Reagan was promising to put more money back into his biweekly paycheck because of tax cuts. So this is why my grandfather voted for a Republican for the first time. But then what interested me about my grandfather's experience is how he then kind of embraced the Republican Party wholesale in the years afterwards on everything from immigration control to welfare to you name it.
That's interesting. How much did, the story that I've always heard, and this I think probably came out of like the efforts for George W. Bush trying to build bridges in the Hispanic community, was that basically about social conservatism, that Hispanic Latino voters tended to be more socially conservative when it came to things like gender roles, like things like abortion, et cetera, et cetera. Is there any truth to that? I mean, or how much did that play? Because I don't know. I mean, I guess abortion becomes an issue in 1973, and I just wonder how much of that was actually in play, or how much of that was just more of a story.
Yeah, I think that's an important part of the story, but I don't think it's the only part of the story. I think that, the issue of abortion has become much more politicized in the fairly recent past, I'm thinking over the past couple of decades, than it was in the 1970s or early 80s. So I will say that, Nixon's pitch and Reagan's pitch to Hispanics had very little to do with abortion in particular. It did have to do with, broadly some sense of family values. But I think one thing I'm trying to do in my book is pay attention to these individual issues like abortion or religious values or family values, but I'm also trying to look at a bigger picture. When I was talking to colleagues, friends about the book I was writing, the first two things they always said were, well, you must be paying a lot of attention to Cubans and a lot of attention to Catholicism. And my answer was always like, yeah, well, that's part of it, but it's certainly not all of it. And I think that if you try to just put it in those boxes of Cuban exile politics or Catholicism, you're really missing a bigger picture, and it makes it seem like a complete surprise when someone like Trump wins 28, 29% of the Hispanic vote. So, I think Catholicism, Cuban exile politics, abortion, other social issues, that's part of it. But I think, some sense of U.S. Latin American relations more broadly has a lot to do with it. I think military service and patriotism has a lot to do with it. I think free enterprise and kind of pro-capitalism has a lot to do with it. So I think it's a kind of much more diverse and complicated history than just social values and social issues like abortion.
When did the dynamic, I mean, you described it in the context of your grandfather, but I know that's also sort of like, just illustrative of what you found, broadly speaking. When did that turn from we're voting for the guy despite the Republicans to we're voting for the Republicans despite the guy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think a lot of it has to do with shifting debates about immigration in the 1990s. I think a lot of it has to do with the kind of rise of nativism within the Republican Party, even in the, earlier in the 1980s. I'm thinking about things like the founding of the group U.S. English, which was a national effort to try to pass a constitutional amendment to make English the official language of the United States. That was a group that had in fact spun out of John Tanton's Federation for American Immigration Reform, a kind of nativist zero population group based in Michigan, but which was also national. And then the rise of people like Pat Buchanan in the late 80s, but then he went on to run a fairly successful primary challenge to George H.W. Bush in 1992. So, I think the rise of nativism within the Republican Party, the move to the right of the Republican Party in the early 1990s on immigration and border control as an issue, that really forced Hispanic Republicans to justify their support for the Republican Party, their continued support for the Republican Party, despite the party's move on issues that many assumed really mattered to Hispanics.
But wait, so I'm confused. So like how, so they're interested in Reagan because of tax cuts? I mean, is that really, I mean, is that how does that track with, let's say, just Reagan, so-called Reagan Democrats? I mean, I think there's increasing evidence that at least a certain percentage of those Reagan Democrats were a function of, the long process of LBJ saying we're going to lose a certain percentage of the country. I think he said the South, but I recently, maybe a year ago, I can't remember the book. I can't. The book escapes me for a moment, but there was a fact in there that even as late as 2008, 50% of non-college educated whites did not perceived the Republican Party to the left of Democrats on race. And it wasn't until the election of Barack Obama that corrective. It was Identity Crisis, I think was the book.
Wow.
And so, I mean, I wonder like how much of is the phenomena of the Reagan Democrat distinct or consist, distinct or, like just running in parallel to increase Latino support, or is it just is it distinct, or is it in some way related?
No, I think it does run parallel. I mean, I brought up taxes as the first issue that my grandpa, in recounting his movement toward the Republican Party, talks about. But I think there was a lot else going on with Reagan as well. I mean, he was the first Republican president to really win massive, widespread support from Cubans because of his strong, anti-communist posture. So even Jimmy Carter in 1976 won like 50% of the Cuban American vote in Florida, and Reagan in his two elections in 80 and 84 won 80, 90%. So he was the first Republican to really just sweep up in Florida. And that's part of it. That's in addition to the tax story. But, Reagan, even as this, nativism was rising within the Republican Party, he himself didn't go along with that. I mean, in his campaign in 1980, he called Mexico the closest ally of the United States. When he met with the Mexican president, Jose Lopez Portillo, he said he didn't think that there needed to be a border wall between the United States and Mexico. There needed to be more cooperation between the United States and Mexico and more exchange. So Mexican Americans didn't see him as someone who, was part of that nativist move within the Republican Party. And then he also advocated for the Immigration Reform and Control Act in 1986, which at the same time that it included kind of punitive measures like employer sanctions, it also led to the naturalization of 2 million Latin American immigrants. So I think Hispanic Republicans really supported that. So I mentioned taxes because it is most closely related to my grandfather's story, but I think there was a whole range of issues that he also supported statehood for Puerto Rico. I think that really spoke to Puerto Ricans as well. So it was a much broader phenomenon, I think.
I want to just put a pin in that because it's still sort of like, it's still unclear. Like all the things you just listed are almost diametrically opposed to what Donald Trump is doing. Right? Like, almost every single one of those things is almost violently diametrically opposed to what Donald Trump is doing. And yet, but before we get there, there was one other thing that, is while just sort of like temporally while we're talking about Reagan and we're talking about, is that you wrote that it's basically almost like a Republican tradition at this point to name the treasurer, not the Treasury Secretary, but the treasurer of the United States to be a Hispanic woman. What's the behind that?
Yeah, it's kind of amazing, isn't it? It's an interesting fact that the dollars that Americans carried around in their pockets in the 70s and 80s all had the signatures of Mexican American Republican women. And the first was during the Nixon years with Romana Acosta Banuelos. The second was Catherine Ortega under Reagan. The third was Catalina Vasquez Villalpando under George H.W. Bush. So, the treasurer of the United States is a largely symbolic position. They sign the currency, oversee the mint, things like that. But it's in some ways it was also a symbolic appointment. And it was part of the Hispanic outreach effort, especially in the run-up to elections. And so the idea was that they would choose Hispanic Republican women who were kind of seen as leaders in their communities to essentially be surrogates. I mean, surrogates on the campaign trail for Republican presidents. And presidential candidates. So they would, go and campaign. And in some cases, they were given a lot of credit for really boosting the Hispanic Republican support for Republican presidential candidates in states like New Mexico or California. And so it was largely symbolic. It was seen as kind of helpful as a measure of recruiting Hispanic voters. And I would say in some ways, it's kind of really symbolic of a Republican strategy with Hispanics. It's much more like top down, where you would have these leaders who would go into the communities and speak, and they would expect the example of these leaders to result in success at the ballot box.
Am I reading too much into it by like, I guess, theorizing that because a lot of these folks or their grandparents or their parents or their great grandparents came to the United States for economic reasons, right? I mean, this is the story of immigrants through that. The idea of seeing a Hispanic name on money had some type of, like, I don't know, a greater resonance. I mean, Donald Trump desperately wanted to sign all the checks. I mean, there's a reason why people want to do that.
Totally. Yeah, no doubt. I mean, so the thing that Romana Acosta Banuelos would say over and over on the campaign trail, really, it's just they would tell narratives about their own personal experience. So over and over, she told stories on the campaign trail to newspaper reporters about how she entered the United States with 36 cents in her pocket. She started a tortilla factory with her aunt. They moved to East Los Angeles, and it eventually became one of the largest Mexican food distributors in the Southwest and in the United States. And that it's still open. So the company now is in, I believe, Gardena, California, and they still have hanging on the wall some of the original samples of dollar bills signed by the company's founder. So for sure, there is this pull yourself up by the bootstraps mentality that Republican presidents really wanted to tap into. I mean, part of what they liked about, part of what Nixon and his administration liked about Banuelos is that she was a business owner. She started with nothing and, became a very successful businesswoman. After she started the tortilla company, she founded banks in East Los Angeles that served the Mexican-American community, some of the first Mexican-American owned banks in California. And then, during the Chicano movement, the kind of civil rights movement for Latinos, she was very much a non-radical. She wasn't arguing for the kind of liberation of the Southwest or reclaiming the Southwest for Mexico, as many other Chicanos were. And she wasn't kind of arguing for gender equality at all. She very much, talked about her role as a homemaker as well. So, I think all of these are signals that the administration wanted to send to the Hispanic community, and they thought that they had really chosen someone who could kind of represent the successful immigrant experience to other Hispanics. And I think that I spent a lot of time talking about Banuelos, but I think that's more or less what they want to do with Ortega and Villalpando and Rosario Marin during the Bush 2 years as well. So for sure.
All right. I want to get to Joe Biden's outreach or lack of outreach in a moment. But getting back to Ronald Reagan gives a pathway for 2 million Mexican Americans or Latin American immigrants to citizenship. He you ticked out Puerto Rican independence. I mean, these are almost diametrically opposed to, and they are. I mean, Donald Trump doesn't. Never mind providing Puerto Rico independence. He won't even provide them any type of aid in the context of major natural disasters. They're pushing for the deportation of DACA recipients. This is how is it that Donald Trump can maintain almost the same percentage of voters, of Hispanic voters, when Reagan attracted them, presumably through these measures, and Donald Trump is running so contrary to them. And it's also, it's not like there's huge hue and cry out of the Republican Party, like, please stop doing this. I mean, how do you reconcile that?
Yeah, it is a big mystery, isn't it? And it's kind of amazing. And the explanation I came up with is a developing sense of loyalty to the party over individual candidates over a long period of time, because otherwise it's not explicable, really, right? I mean, on issue over issue after issue, political scientists find that Latinos kind of just skew liberal. And how is it then that approximately the same percentage of Hispanics support someone like Trump as supported George H.W. Bush, who was a Republican leader of a much different kind? So I'll tell you like one quick story about an interview I did with one Hispanic Republican leader in 2015, just right after Trump announced his candidacy. And at that point, they didn't love Donald Trump. He didn't love Donald Trump, but he said that even if I don't love Donald Trump personally, I'm not going to let one man ruin the movement that I and others have spent decades building. So that to me struck me, because it was exactly the opposite logic that Reagan's Hispanic campaign advisors used in the late 1970s. So that's kind of where I really came up with this idea about the shift that I'm trying to explain is the shift from man over party to party over man. So loyalty is one of the ways it just makes sense to me that Hispanic Republicans continue to support Republican candidates despite all of the changes within the Republican Party. So Puerto Ricans, for example, they still, the main issue for Puerto Rican Republicans on the island, and there is a Puerto Rican Republican Party on the island, and Puerto Rican Republicans in the United States is pushing for statehood. That has seemed like a possibility at earlier moments in the history that I write, like namely the George H.W. Bush administration, when George Bush the first kind of used his State of the Union address to vocally and personally support statehood for the island, and that really kind of set off a flurry of activity in San Juan and Washington to try to make it a reality. That's a whole other story. But now, you have a candidate who, now a president who was a candidate at the time, joked about how he would push to make Puerto Rico a state only if Puerto Rico could guarantee him 2 Republican senators. So, it's a dramatic shift in the Republican Party, yet the Puerto Rican Republicans, both on the island and the mainland, still have the territorial status of the island and the push to make it a state as their foremost goal. And I think that that's representative of the experience of a lot of Latinos, because they're really hanging on to these core issues like statehood or anti-communism or free enterprise. And no matter how much Trump slights them, I mean, on Twitter, in speeches, in
policy,
the beginning of his campaign. Yeah, go ahead.
In policy and in So let me ask you this. Is there also a big age divide on these issues?
Yeah.
Because it feels like there's a lot of people who are sort of that like I said, it took a long time for the Civil Rights Act to sort out, for a lot of people, like, what party they belong to. There was still this big tradition for in the South of, I'm Democrat because my daddy was a Democrat and his daddy was a Democrat. And then they wake up one day and they realize, like, wait a second, the Democrats aren't the Democrats that I remember, and the Republicans aren't the Republicans I remember. I mean, is that happening with Hispanic voters? Are when we talk about a Hispanic Republicans, are we talking about primarily people over the age of blank?
Yeah, I think that has a lot to do with it. The first thing I'll say is that this is a super interesting issue that is really important for the Latino electorate, for understanding the Latino electorate, that also still needs so much more attention in a kind of empirical, systematic, comprehensive way than it has gotten so far. So, you hear a lot of things about the Latino youth. First, it's Latino youth who are kind of really upping the Democrats' registration efforts. There's a great kind of project by PRI and the World's kind of radio network out of Boston, program out of Boston, that they have a program called Every 30 Seconds. And the idea is that every 30 seconds, a Latino turns 18 and is becoming eligible to vote, and that's going to be the thing that really shifts politics in the United States as the Latino population continues to grow. So there's a lot of attention to youth, but I don't think there are great kind of systematic studies. I think, things like, we know this anecdotally from even the Democratic primary, where it tended to be Latino youth who were driving support for Bernie Sanders, and kind of older Latinos who were still supporting Joe Biden. We also know stories about, from Florida, about how it's younger Cubans who are kind of tilting the Latino vote in Florida. I would add Puerto Ricans to that story as well. But even that is kind of like an anecdotal understanding of it, because of how Barack Obama did in 2008 and 2012. And then I should note that Donald Trump did better in 2016 in Florida among Latinos than Mitt Romney did in 2012. So things kind of moved back toward the Republican Party in 2016. And I've been really interested in this and have been doing some interviews with recent high school graduates from Southern Florida and talking to them about where their political understandings came from. And in many ways, they were shaped by their views have been shaped by their very conservative Latin American parents. And so they've embraced their parents' politics. So all of this is to say that it's a really important issue. I'm not as convinced as others seem to be that youth are going to skew things toward Democrats in a way that they haven't in earlier elections, but we'll see. I mean, anecdotal evidence suggests that they might.